Hi, everyone, and welcome to another webinar in our Conference Connect webinar series. We're so happy that you are here. And if you're watching on recording, thank you for watching. We have an incredible guest today, someone who can really provide a tremendous amount of value for you and help leverage podcasts for further and more speaking engagements. So increasing speaking fees, increasing the demand, and he is going to talk all about that and also some tips and tricks on how you can take action today, but then also on opportunities if you want to pursue working with Spencer. I have a lot of friends who have worked with Spencer, so I'm obviously very biased. I've worked with Spencer in other capacities as well, but I have a lot of friends who've had tremendous success working with Spencer and getting on podcasts and translating that for speaking gigs. So I'm really excited to hear from you, Spencer. I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. And everybody that is already here, if you wouldn't mind in the chat, just drop what industry you're in and if you've already done speaking gigs, like how many you've done, or if you haven't, that's okay too. But might be able to work some of that into the conversation if anybody's willing to share that information. Should we wait another minute for anybody, or should I just get going, Ashley?
Um, Maybe just yeah, it's coming in now. So we have someone who writing a book, going to a seminar this month for speaking and getting 5 reels,
Cool.
which is excellent. So what Spencer, I think, is asking, correct me if I'm wrong. Yep, Melissa, I think, got the assignment here. Educational consultant and professional development presenter, 60 or so talks. Um, so what industry specifically you're in? I think that's what you're looking for, right, Spencer?
Yeah, and I mean that's fine. I just wanted to know who's in here and what they are seeing the benefit of being podcasts
And
on
one
the
more
front end.
person just wrote, I speak about bringing humor into the workplace. Thanks so much for adding that, Rob.
Cool. Cool. All right. Well, we'll get started. So, um, yeah, this is a webinar that is meant to help you go get booked on more podcasts. And whether that is because you're brand new to the speaking world and see this as a way to help build up some of your credibility, or you're someone that has done a ton of speaking already and want to use this as a tool for new presentations or just more SEO, this is meant to help you have all the tools you need to start getting yourself booked on more podcasts. So I'll just jump into a little bit about who I am, why I got into this, and just a little bit about how I've fell into this position. So I was in the music industry for 15 years. I started off booking concerts in my hometown and then scaled that up to doing multi-day music conferences and festivals. And I was a concert promoter and ran some small record labels and stuff like that. But pretty much all along the way, I was always dealing on either side of talent representation. And then when I found podcasts, I thought that everyone I was listening to was like a celebrity entrepreneur, like Richard Branson or Mark Cuban or something like that. And then I came to find out they were really just Joe Schmo investor, Joe Schmo entrepreneur. And that's not to talk down on them by any means. It was really just they were not a celebrity, but they were really accomplished and they were really good at what they did, and they were willing to give their information away. And I thought that was really cool. So podcast became a very normal part of my life, in the car, using as a way to learn. Um, but then COVID hit and it shut down the whole industry. And so for a lot of people, it was, not just when does their industry come back? When do live events come back? But it actually, my boss passed away. So for me, it was also just like, do I even have a job when I come back, or when events come back? And so I decided I would, while stuck at home, just help all of these entrepreneurs that I knew were also stuck at home. They couldn't go to conferences, they couldn't go to expos, they couldn't host meetups or anything like that. And this was a platform where I recognized anybody could stand out. In traditional publicity, you had to hire a public relations company and hope that they could get you on all the morning shows. And, even if you could get on all of them, they're limited. But now the space of podcasts has really opened it up. So anybody can host their own, their own show, can have their own platform. All of the people that were on the morning shows in the past now can host their own thing. And so I saw this as a really undervalued industry for anybody that was looking for another marketing vehicle to either promote their book or promote their service or raise capital or whatever it might be. So I shifted in 2020, and in that time, I've booked over 2,500 interviews for over 300 entrepreneurs, and those interviews, there's a wide variety of shows I've worked with. There's a wide variety of entrepreneurs I've worked with. But some of the shows I've been able to land clients on include Motley Fool Money, Bigger Pockets, The Subtle Art of Not Giving an F with Mark Manson, Matt and Shane Secret Podcast, which is Shane Gillis's podcast, which is ranked #1 in comedy, Wild Ride with Steve-O. There are a bunch of shows that I've been able to secure interviews for a variety of clients, always using the same type of pitch and the same tools that I'm going to teach you guys about here today. So the first thing that I really like to explain to people is why podcasts are valuable to them as a marketing vehicle, because this is pretty universal. The surface level idea is that it's a new audience. You can get in front of someone else's platform, and maybe that turns into a lead. Maybe that turns into a customer or something like that. That's very surface level, and it might happen, it might not, but there's a lot of other things that come with it. It's really great as a way to help establish your authority in your space. As speakers, you know how important that is. Being able to point to your body of work as a way to provide more credibility as to why you're an expert in your industry, why you should be hired, is something that I imagine you're all looking for pretty much all the time. And so this can help with that. I have SEO here at the bottom. I'll jump to that real quick. This ties in with the credibility piece, because if someone is researching you, let's say you've just made a bid to or submitted a topic for consideration with the speaking bureau, they're going to want to look you up. And if the first thing they see, or the only thing they really see, is just your website, your LinkedIn, and your Instagram, where you've said great things about yourself, they can take it for what it's worth, but it's not, they understand it's things you wrote about yourself. It's not anything that anybody else said about you. But if you go on 10 podcasts, suddenly there's a wide variety and diversity in your results that come up when people look for you. Usually it's going to be a variety of topics. So like each podcast is going to have its own title. So if any of you have used some of like the press release tools from Yahoo Finance or whatever, that's a great way to diversify some of your SEO, but it's always the same title from all of the same outlets that put out your press release. Whereas if you do podcast, everyone's going to have their own show title. They're going to have their own show notes. It's going to be a unique conversation each time. Some shows are stronger on YouTube, whereas some are stronger on Apple Podcasts or stronger on Substack or something. And so it's going to really diversify the backlinks to your name. And this is something that, someone looking at you might not even listen to all of these things, but if they just see that you've gotten out there and you've been a guest in a variety of places, that does a lot for establishing your credibility. So I really think that SEO diversity is something that's a little bit underlooked by a lot of people. The other great thing about just going on podcasts is the ability to get some clarity and practice in your presentation and your topics. I don't know how many people on this have never done a speaking engagement before, but you make a profile on Conference Connect, you line up 2 or 3, and you now have to like really practice it. And I'm sure there's some nerves that are associated with it. You could practice for months. You could really have it down pat when you're at home. But once you get in front of people, nerves can take over and it can be a little bit daunting. But podcasts are like a really low stress opportunity for you to get out there and get some practice. And even if you are someone that's experienced, if you are now starting to turn out new topics, podcasts are a way for you to go out and really refine that message. The great thing about it is it's more of a conversation with the host rather than a presentation. Like right now, I'm presenting to you. The only difficult part about this whole process for me was actually making this slide deck. I've never had to make that before. I've done 50 plus podcasts where I got on and got to converse with someone. So I know what it is I want to say, but I never had to really prepare this way before. But it comes back to having done so many podcasts in the past. It was easy because I already knew what I wanted to say. I've gone over this a lot of times with people and speaking at other events about going on podcasts. So this is a low stress opportunity where you're just conversing with one person, the host, and that you get feedback in real time too. You might make a point and the host might say, well, what about this? And then you learn how to address that in your talk early on before you actually have to get up on stage and do it. So I would recommend anybody, if you've got a call, a speaking engagement lined up, go book 5 podcasts where you can practice it before you even have to get up on stage and present those topics. The other thing I really like about podcasts is just that there's longevity there. You get up and speak in front of a room. The people that are there, they hear it, they then go home. There might be live recordings afterwards, but I don't know how many people really tune into something after they've missed it. If you run ads or something like that on social media as a marketing tool, once that ad budget is gone, the ads are done. Podcast, though, it lives forever. The show will continue to grow. And if a show has dedicated fans, those fans tend to go back in older episodes and see who else was on. It's usually something that happens with the most, the 20% most engaged fans with the show, but it's something where lots of people have said they had someone reach out to them after hearing them on a podcast that was actually recorded 3 years earlier. So it's something that's evergreen and can continue to grow organically in that way. So I might have gone a little bit long there. You're all here. You all understand why podcasts are valuable, but I always like going over the full scope of things. So we'll jump right into how do you identify the podcast you want to go on to? And so I always remember KAOR, keywords, audience, outcome, and reputable figures. Um, I imagine as speakers, you have all done some sort of similar practice when determining what topics you want to speak on, and maybe some of the titles of your keynotes. But it transfers really over to podcast as well. So identifying some of the key words that your audience is looking for or that relate to your industry is something you can then use to then go search for podcasts, whether that's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Google. Typing in those keywords with the word podcast will show you some relevant shows that you should be looking to get onto. Additionally, you can look at who the audience is. So maybe the keyword from your industry isn't something that returns all the results that you need. But for example, I work with a lot of real estate investors. A lot of people that are looking to get into real estate are people that are looking for financial freedom, or maybe they type in, podcasts on how to become a millionaire, something like that. Millionaire and financial freedom are not keywords in the real estate industry, but an audience that's looking for that type of thing might gravitate towards shows on real estate. And so combining the keywords and the audience into a search is going to be a good way for you to find shows that are relevant to your industry. You can also do this with outcome. So I mentioned millionaire, how to become a millionaire. Then we'll return a show about real estate. So identifying what the outcome is for your potential attendee or whoever it is that you're trying to cater to is something that will help you in developing what are the shows I should be going after. And then if you're still drawing a blank or you're just looking for other things as ways to search for podcasts, look at the other people in your industry. What shows have they been on? Where are they hanging out at? Whether that's podcasts or even LinkedIn communities or Facebook communities or things like that. Those are places where you can go and start building a little bit of traction with that community, and then see if there's like podcasts associated with it or people within the community that have a podcast, and kind of follow their lead. Now, if they are the biggest name in your industry, it might be a little bit difficult. If you are in more general life coaching, looking for where Tony Robbins has been might be a little bit of a wasted effort. He's going on only the biggest podcasts in the world, and that's a little bit more difficult to accomplish and landing that type of gig for yourself. But look for someone else that's in your space that's ahead of you, but maybe not the biggest in the industry, and then use that as a jumping off point for where you can start doing some outreach and pitching uh, to get on shows that are going to elevate yourself a little bit. So the next thing I want to touch on is the actual pitch itself. This is something that's very nuanced, and it's kind of too much for me to put into one slide. So I'm happy to go over it verbally, but I always use the same format when I am pitching to shows. I use what I call the guest method. You grab attention, you have a unique value proposition, you have an engaging bio, you have solid credentials, and you have tangible social proof. So grabbing attention is the subject line. I usually lead off every podcast pitch with one of the hooks that I've developed as a topic for all my clients because that's what I want to get their attention. I actually don't use something like podcast guest submission and then your name. Like if they don't know who you are, your name doesn't do anything. I actually put the name last. I use the hook and then I say the person's name. Um, and that's just because, I don't know who's on the other end. You've got to grapple with. You might be pitching to the host. You might be pitching to the producer. You might be pitching to a disinterested assistant. Um, and you might be coming at them in a busy time in their life. Maybe you're in finance industry and you're pitching to somebody that's full-time job is actually as a CPA and it's tax season. They're going to be bogged down, and um, you're not trying to create work for them, but you're trying to grab their attention. So maybe, in that example of a CPA, if you can grab their attention with a subject line that gets them to open the email, then they see you're a quick fit for the podcast. Even if they're, in tax time and super busy, they can say, yes, you can be on the show. Here's a scheduling link. That's actually how a lot of this stuff works. There's usually not a ton of back and forth or negotiation or anything like that. You submit a podcast idea, or you submit yourself with some, ideas on what you could speak about, and they usually just say yes or no. It's a very quick process, and so I use this method to get them to quickly say yes. So by having that catchy subject line, you can grab their attention real quick. And no matter how busy they are, you can easily get them to consider whether or not you make sense for the show. So the next thing would be, the intro. I always say, I'm reaching out about so and so client to be on. I insert the host name. I'm sorry, the host show, and then I lead off with the three leading topics. So the subject line is the first leading topic. Then the intro line is the next three topics I think are the most interesting. That's because usually three topics is more than enough to cover an entire podcast interview. I oftentimes have a section in the pitch that is more like 5 to 6 topics, just in case they want some more variety. But typically, that intro line is just highlighting the three most unique topics. And this is where, coming back to you all as speakers, you've probably already done a lot of this work. This is actually the hardest part for most of the pitches I do, is really curating what are those topics that are going to bring value to the host and their audience. Because you're not there to pitch. Podcasts are not a pitch fest. They're not an infomercial. They're nothing like that. They are almost exclusively value driven. What value can you provide the audience? And maybe that value then leads back to them working with you, or a lead magnet that you have or something like that. But um, Sorry, I lost my train of thought, everybody. Yeah, I'm sorry. The intro line is really just focusing on those topics so that the host can quickly see the value that you can bring them. But then we jump into the bio. You don't want the bio to be too short or too long. You also don't want it to be off topic. And so I typically just lead off with two paragraphs. And the first paragraph is one that is a little bit it's a little bit of your backstory. So, how you got to where you are and how you became an expert in your industry. And then the second paragraph is more like who you work with, what you do for them, and what you've accomplished. Kind of that, here's what they do today, or, since starting in the industry, this is what, we've grown to 50 million, annual recurring revenue. That type of thing is what I'd put in the second paragraph. And so this is why I say it's nuance. If you're new in the industry, you're going to have a way shorter bio or a lot less to talk about than maybe a 30-year veteran. Also, there's some people out there that like their story and their angle isn't just related to their career. There are a lot of people that have maybe gone through a traumatic life event, or maybe they learned out of a failure. Maybe they're more well known because of building up a company and then losing it all. These are all things that you kind of have to use a little bit of your best judgment to determine where it makes sense to use more words or use less words. So it's I kind of just use this framework as something as a jumping off point, and you can then use a little bit more of your judgment to determine should you have a shorter bio or should you have a longer bio. If you go back to someone that's maybe new in their industry or they're not as established, too much bio is mostly going to be fluff and filler. Going back to who these podcast hosts are, you don't want to give them fluff and filler. That's fluff and filler is how they know a VA is doing the work of pitching or AI is doing the work of pitching. Um, Using some real uh, being able had the personal touch of understanding that pretty much every host on the other side, this is a hobby for them. Maybe not a hobby, it's a marketing vehicle, but most of them are not full-time hosts. They've got a job, they've got a business, maybe they've got multiple businesses. And so you really want to have something that is as concise as possible while delivering as much information as possible so that they can really understand that you are who you say you are and that you can provide the information and do have the expertise without sending like a novel. And in addition to that, you don't want to add information that's not helpful. Um, there are lots of people that get started with me that will send the bio they have, and it mentions that they love being a girl dad and they love coaching their son's soccer team and they love fishing in the Outer Banks in the summer, something like that. None of that is helpful in this in this situation. None of that gets you the interview. The exception being if you're in parenting and you then talk about being a parent and that's the industry that you're working in, then you want to include that, or you're pitching to a show that's about fishing or something, sure, include all of that. It's usually not helpful when you're reaching out to more industry specific podcasts. Ashley has been a competitive equestrian. We do know, I do know a show where the person's in real estate but he's also really into horses. So if she knows that about him, she can include that in her pitch to him. But most of the time, it's not going to be super relevant. The the exception being going back to maybe how you got to where you're at in your industry. Maybe she was a really, she was a competitive, um, uh, competitive equestrian. That was going to be her path, but then an injury sidelined her. She then had to rebuild in a new industry. That's good for that first paragraph in your pitch because it's showing some humanity, it's showing some background, it is providing a little bit of nuance to how you got to where you're at. But again, it's not always going to be that way. And this is where you have to use some of your judgment. You can also reach out to me. I'm happy to give people any feedback on what their pitch looks like after this. But I'll move on. So on top of this I'm sure you've all done this as speakers. You want to include some of your other credentials. Like, do you have any? Um, what are your educational credentials? Have you done other speaking gigs before? Have you done other press? Are you an author? Things like that are something that I include in its own section on the pitch. I have like a section, it's like accolades or more about section where I kind of list those things. Like if you've been in the military, if you did compete in athletics at a collegiate or professional level, that's something where you can, kind of add it as like the more about section. And it's meant to be further down so that the person that you grab their attention with the subject line. They then read the intro. They continued, they still wanted to read more. They read your bio. Now, further down here, are some other things just in case it sparks any additional interest from them. Um, that's what I do in this like more about section. And so some of you though, you might not have this. My podcast pitch doesn't have this. I didn't graduate college. I've never done anything exceptional in sports or anything like that. Um, I have a section in my pitch where I say, here's some shows I've booked clients on, and here's some podcasts I've done where you can see that. I kind of have it as its own like small paragraph that's one or two sentences. You can also do something like that. But if you haven't presented anything yet, or you don't have any awards you've won or boards you serve on, it's okay. Just leave it out. It's actually great because now you have a more concise bio and a more concise pitch. So don't worry about it if that's not something you have. And then at the very bottom of this, I also include websites and social media. Um, Obviously, you don't want to just pitch and then not give them any direction to where they can go see more about your personality or your website or anything like that. Additionally, if you have, let's say, over 1,000 followers on any given social media platform, I also include that. So I'll put the link on, to Instagram, and then in parentheses, I'll put, 3,000 followers, and then the link to LinkedIn, where I have about, I think it's like 3,800 followers or something. I include that. That way, the person can see that you do have a following. There are people that listen to you. Also, if you have an email list, include how many subscribers you have to that, or subscribers on YouTube. If you have a YouTube channel, include things like that because then it shows the host that you have an audience and that if you promote the episode that you are getting in front of, let's just say 10,000 across all of your social media platforms in your email list. That's really valuable to them. I've had podcast hosts come back to me and say, one of the main criteria we're looking at moving forward is that we want unique stories and we want value, but we've been doing this a long time. We need to be getting in front of more people. So we're only accepting guests that have, let's just say baseline 7,500 followers across all social media platforms. So them being able to see that without having to click all the links is really valuable in them seeing that that you do have a following and that you're going to promote it to your audience, which is going to benefit them. That's their main, reason for having you on the show. Some hosts just don't think they could do a solo podcast. They riff better off of, having someone else there to go back and forth with. But they really want the show to grow from getting in front of your audience the same way you want your reputation to grow from getting in front of their audience. So it's, there's a win-win partnership here. And so being able to really show them that you have a following is helpful, but it's not a game killer. If you don't have more than 1,000 on any platform, just don't include that part. Still include the links. There are people that will still have you on their show. I mentioned that I had a client on Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast, which is ranked #1 comedy. The person I had on that show, I think he's got like 400 Instagram followers and he's not on any other social media. He doesn't even use his Instagram for business. It's just personal. He had a really good, unique life situation, that was able to grab their attention. But social media following was something you didn't have at all. So it doesn't mean you won't get shows if you don't have a following already. But if you have something to bolster there, it's great. So I'm just going to show you real quick my sample bio. I really don't want you to have to read all of this. It's, it's a lot of text, but ultimately, I just wanted to show you that I lead with those topics that I think are going to be the most useful to the host. And then my entire bio is 5 sentences. And it encompasses 20 years of of my career being in music and then switching over to podcasting. Um, this is what I would consider like a short to medium sized bio. There are some people that have a 30-year career or they had a life event that is really important to their brand now that requires more words. So don't be scared to include that if you need to. But this is totally doable for a podcast bio. I also put just some of my sample topics over to the side. Um, as it relates to the KAOR, acronym I used earlier, I don't implement it as well in my sample topics as I could, but that's because my subject matter is really applicable to a lot of people. So I don't just list like this is how it could help solopreneurs or this is how it could help real estate investors. It's more broad, and I do that on purpose. You might be in the same situation, but for example, Rob, who does, talks about bringing humor into the workplace, that sounds more off the bat to me like someone that's in corporate America. So you could be a little more specific there. Or, Melissa, who's an educational consultant, you can be more specific as to who you cater those topics to. But again, coming back to you all being speakers already, I imagine the topics are something that you've already put a lot of thought into because those are essentially your keynote presentations. So I also imagine that some of you would not want to be pitching topics that you're about to give away for free on podcasts when you're trying to get paid for them on, through corporate America. So, balance that, take some things out of what your keynote presentation would be, but you can still address those topics in podcast interviews. And that kind of leads into something I'll talk about in the next slide, which is, how you're really leveraging these podcast interviews. But before I get that, I just want to show you some of the tools I use. So whether at the end of this you want to work with me or you just want to get some feedback on your pitch or something like that, I always recommend people go make a Podmatch profile. This is a platform that connects hosts that are looking for guests and guests that are looking for hosts, and they've got a ton of industries that are represented on there. I think it's $20 a month or something, and you can go book as many podcasts as you want. If you take that format that I just sent you, you get a subject line, get a bio, get your social links and get your topics there and just put them in a, Google Doc or something. If you then go over to Podmatch and make a profile, they will create like your online profile for podcast pitching, similar to, what's on Conference Connect. And you can then immediately start pitching yourself to podcasts. Additionally, podcast hosts will get notified that you just made a profile and they'll come check you out and maybe send you some invitations. And Podmatch also um, does daily recommendations for you where they will use if you have tags for what your industry is on your profile, they can then sift through the shows on Podmatch and make suggestions for shows. So it's really easy to go on there every day, spend 10 minutes, submit yourself to a handful of shows, also see if you had any interviews come in. And this is how you can quickly build up a lot of podcast interviews for that SEO diversity, for the content you want to repurpose, for honing in your message. Like, this is the easiest way to do it very quickly. If you do this today, you will probably have some podcast interviews by the end of this week, if not sooner. I also recommend podcastguest.com. It's similar. You can make a profile, but it's not necessarily a platform matching people. You can make a profile and podcast hosts can go look for you. You can also go look for podcast shows. But what I really like about podcastguest.com is they send out 3 emails a week. So I get 3 emails a week that are like 10 guests that are looking for shows and, some of their credibility and all that stuff, as well as 10 shows that are looking for guests. And so that's just a really cool function. It's a wide variety of shows, a wide variety of guests, but I always look through all of them. And there are premium options there. You can pay to be a featured expert or something on there. I think it's a couple $100 or something like that. Um, Personally, I haven't had a ton of experience on the paid portion, trying to use it to get more interviews for my clients. So I don't really use as much, but I do like sifting through their weekly emails just to see what's out there. Who's looking for guests right now? Do any of my clients fit that? And then obviously back to like identifying some of the um, the people in your industry that are going on podcasts, just doing that search on Apple Podcast or Spotify or something like that is going to be some of the best research you can find, because that's where all of the podcasts are. Podmatch or podcastguest.com are only identifying people that are their customers that have already signed up and claimed a show on their platform or something like that. Um, so like even with something like Podmatch, while you can get a lot of podcasts out of it, if you are in a very specific industry, you're still going to have to go outside of Podmatch to maximize using podcasts as a marketing strategy because it doesn't have all shows. It just has the shows that are run by hosts that are looking to use this platform to find guests. So, for example, working with a lot of people in real estate, there are hundreds of real estate shows on Podmatch. There's probably about 25 that are real estate specific, but maybe there are more that are in investing as a whole or again, financial freedom or something. So I can still get a lot out of it. But if I really want to get to a lot of shows, I still have to go outside and do a lot of manual outreach. Um, and also the biggest shows, the ones that you're really going to get super excited about being on, they're usually not using something like Podmatch or podcastguest.com. They don't need a platform to match them with people. They are either using connections and introductions or they're looking at the cold outreach that I've taught you about doing here today. They have tons of inflow of people wanting to be on the show, so they don't need to use a platform to match with people. So these are great though, again, for just getting started real quick. Podcastguest.com and Podmatch are great for you just put in 10 minutes a day or something like that. Where are all the podcasts? I know Apple Podcasts, but where else? So podcasts are distributed. Um, they're usually a host goes through one platform and that pushes them out to everywhere. So they're on Apple Podcasts, they're on Spotify. There are also other podcast hosting and distribution platforms out there, but Spotify and Apple are the two biggest. Amazon did it for a while. They closed it down. I think they just kind of merged with Spotify or something. And then YouTube. YouTube is where a lot of shows are as well. And there's plenty of shows that might look small on Apple Podcasts, but they're actually pretty big on YouTube. It's just a matter of where people are kind of focusing. And that's where I was talking about that SEO diversity. So one show might be big on YouTube, but they're small on Apple. So your name and your episode is going to show up in the Google results on YouTube. And then for a different show that focuses more on the podcast side, it's, you're going to get a link for Apple. So it's really good for showing a variety of places you've been featured. So I'll move on to some of the follow up. 50% of podcasts I book, if not more, come from a follow up email. Again, going back to who the host is. Hosts are busy people. They usually are not podcasting full time. This is something they do on the side. It's a marketing vehicle, it's a hobby, whatever you want to call it. And so they might not see it the first time. Maybe you email them at 9 a.m. and that's when they have a team meeting and they then have something else afterwards and they forget to respond. Maybe you emailed them in the evening and that's when they're with family. I mean, we've all been there. We know how emails fall through the cracks. And so I always recommend doing 2 follow up emails, maybe 3 if you really want to show and you really think you're a good fit. But I imagine that if you spread out 3 touch points over 3 weeks or 4 weeks, you've hit them at all the times you could have. And if you haven't heard back, it's maybe just not a fit. There are some shows that just go over all guests quarterly. Um, and there are some shows that will tell you that, they'll let you know, hey, you'll get an automated response saying, hey, we go over these each quarter. We'll be in touch with her if we're interested. Some haven't set up any of that system at all. Just setting up the podcast was enough work for them. And so They just leave them all unresponded to until they want to send out their invites. That's just how it goes. Every podcast has their own system. So I really recommend that you send an email, your pitch. I usually follow up like 8 days later the next time, and then maybe like 9 days later after that. So it's really spread out over close to a month. I also don't do it the same time. So I specifically said 8 days and 9 days. There's something robotic to me about if you follow up every Tuesday at 10 a.m. That seems kind of weird. Um, and so, back to wanting to make sure the host knows that you're not a VA and you're not AI doing this outreach, kind of randomizing the follow up or the appearance of randomization is helpful, I think, in just showing a little bit of a human touch there. And in that follow up, it's not just hey, following up. You want to reiterate why you think you would be a good guest on the show. So usually my follow-ups are 2 to 3 sentences. It's sometimes like, I really think your listeners would benefit from this, this topic, assuming you know who the listeners are. If you don't know who the listeners are, don't pretend you do. You can just say, I'd love to talk about this on your show and let them decide if it's a fit or it's not. And this is also where like maybe you've included in your initial follow-up, if you have those credentials, maybe you included 10 podcasts you've been on and some articles and some webinars, blah blah blah. Narrow it down to like 2 or 3. What are the 2 or 3 things that you think would be the most beneficial? Or seeing that name, like you were featured in Forbes recently, what's going to be the thing that's going to catch their attention most and that they'll want to click on real quick, just to kind of verify it all. If you still don't hear back from them, I send one more follow up. Just I tell them this is the last time I'm following up. I'm not trying to be pushy. If you don't think it's a fit, I'd love to know why. Ask them for that response. Ask them for that rejection, because it will either let you know you've done something wrong, or they'll say something about how this is presented the wrong way for their audience. But maybe there's an opportunity there for you to say, like, oh, well, I can actually talk about that. I just the way I have this, this topic is presented right now is really for the masses, but I can go more in depth on this subject if that's what you want me to do. So I look for that last one to try and get their response or their feedback if I can. That way I can either make note or, it's an opportunity to try again with the host now that they've actually told you why it's not a fit. So how does this all help you as speakers? How does being on podcast? As I mentioned, you might go onto a show, get in front of an audience, get a lead, get a customer, that type of thing. That's all great, but it's not always going to happen. But there are still lots of benefits. We went over the SEO and being able to curate your topics and that type of thing. But it's also content. I mean, I'm sure all of you need content for your LinkedIn or your Instagram or your website, especially if you haven't done any speaking engagements yet. I do know someone that creates speaker reels for new speakers, but if they're new, they haven't done any speaking yet. So a key component of that speaking reel is actually podcast interviews. It's being able to pull from those podcast interviews some of your hottest takes on the subject. This is also something where if you are going back and forth with someone at a speaker bureau or someone that you're really hoping will hire you, and they say, can you send us a sample of this topic that you've presented to us? Maybe you don't have a full keynote presentation to send them just yet, but you can send them a 10-minute clip from a podcast where you did go over it, and it's mostly a summary of what it is you would talk about on their stage. That's like really helpful in being able to like even if you had the full presentation, like I don't know if anybody wants to go sit down and look at your 30-minute presentation when considering whether or not to hire you. If you can give them something shorter, that's really helpful. And so this is content that you can use for your speaker reel, for your website, for your social media, and we all know that that's just really important. Like you might be putting out content and it's just because you need to the appearance of being busy. This is not content you don't have to sit down and make. It's already been made for you during the podcast interview. And even better, you didn't then have to edit it. You didn't have to pay someone to edit it. Podcast hosts will send you advertising materials a lot of the time that you can just post on social media. They made it at their expense. You get to use it for free. And now your content calendar gets filled up, and the things that you're able to share, some of the messages you want to get out there, you can highlight the best parts from that podcast and put it out on social media. Um, Back to what I said about being able to show the person that you're pitching to, as for speaking gigs, some of the topics you can cover, but also the questions you answer. This is where you can really showcase some of that. And again, you can also refine it. So maybe you start off with the first idea and the first concept of your keynote and realize after doing 5 interviews that like there's a better way to do it. So that's something you can use. And then you have this already recorded. As you've refined it over time, you have the recording done. And you can really, kind of repurpose it and put it on your website or that type of thing. So this is, ultimately you can take all of this and go get yourself booked on podcasts today. But it also takes a lot of time. You can go on Podmatch and just look at the 6 recommendations they make a day and wait for the podcast guest.com emails and see if there's podcasts, that fit for you, and you can send out those type of, submissions. And this is just something you can kind of incorporate into your day for probably under an hour a week. But again, those are a lot of low hanging fruit. If getting on podcasts regularly is something that you really want to do, you either have to dedicate some time to it, dedicate an assistant to it, hire a VA. And quite frankly, that's just not their skill set. This is enough of a skill set that this is my only career. Is I just book people on podcasts because there's a lot of podcasts out there. It takes a lot of time, a lot of follow up. Even when you get the podcast booked, it doesn't come out for it might not happen for a few months, and then it might not come out for a few more months, and you then have to go back and collect all the stuff. I mean, it does take a lot, especially if you want to be on more than 5 podcasts. If you just want 5, Podmatch and podcastguest.com are perfect for you. And you could just do 5 a year that way. But if you really want this to be something that you really incorporate into your marketing vehicle and get the most out of, it is helpful to work with somebody. And I've got like templates I can send you. Like my email's right here. Reach out to me if you just want feedback on your pitch, if you want a link to Podmatch, if you want recommendations for podcast mics or lighting. I have a template for how you can use the KOR acronym and develop some of those topics. I can send all of that to you, and I even have video walkthroughs for it. All of that you can do for free. But if you're looking for someone to work with, you know, let me know. Schedule a call. Scan the QR code, and we can chat about whether or not it's something that makes sense for you. I'm offering 15% off to all Conference Connect users. If you decide to reach out, but a call is free. We can find out if it makes sense for you. And again, regardless, I really recommend just go make that Podmatch profile and try it out. You can do that for free and have interviews by the end of this week. Also, some of you might be thinking, maybe I just want to have my own podcast. That's something where you get to control the narrative, you get to control who you talk to. That's another thing we do. It's actually a side of the business my fiance runs. So if you're thinking about starting your own podcast, let me know and we can talk about that as well.
Wow, that was incredible, Spencer. Thank you so much for all of this information. Thank you for the resources and really a step-by-step action plan on how everyone, including myself, could take action this afternoon, even. So this was phenomenal. I'm going to open it up now for a few questions. I see we have some folks that are chiming in with some of their own personal stories, but if you have any questions at all, please feel free to type them in the chat and Spencer can take a few minutes now and answer them. If you are watching the recording, we will be sending out all of the information that you've seen here and contact information, excuse me, for Spencer. So you'll be able to connect directly with Spencer and work with Spencer. For someone who does podcasting a lot, it is a job in and of itself. So to work with someone like Spencer, you may start off, and I think Spencer's kind of like giving you a little bit of taste of the poison kind of thing. Like, yeah, you can go and do this yourself. And what ends up happening is you get kind of hooked on it because it creates all these additional opportunities for you. So there is a real direct relationship between podcasting and getting paid to speak. And then also having, if you want to end up having products or services that you want to complement your paid speaking gigs. So this is all something that could be the, catalyst for those future revenue streams that you're looking to build. And Spencer can help you with all of those aspects of getting to not only getting speaking, but getting on the right podcast. Because I think that was a really important point that you were making earlier and on how to identify the correct podcast. I think a lot of people, when they first get started, just focus on traction, which is great. But
Hmm.
then at some point, you have to pivot from traction to identifying value of your time and what you're trying to build. And that's
Hmm.
something that Spencer has an incredible track record of doing for all of the folks that he works with. So, once again, thank you so much. I don't see any questions here, but I'm sure you'll receive questions afterwards. I also want to thank everyone for joining another Conference Connect webinar. If you're watching on replay, thank you so much for watching the replay. As always, please make sure to go on Conference Connect to review Spencer as a speaker as well, so that he has those positive reviews, because I'm sure there will be positive reviews after this webinar to support his business growth as well. Thank you so much, Spencer. Is there anything in closing before we go?
Uh, I just two thoughts as you were talking about like how this is something that can be that can help with additional products is like I know people that do 15 podcasts and then take the transcripts and then send that to a self-publishing company and get like their first draft of a book done. And again, it's usually using AI or something to summarize it all, and you can't just then put that out. But if as speakers, I know a lot of you are authors or you're looking to be authors. This is something where you can take the time you dedicate to podcast and get like the first draft of your book done and really expedite that type of thing. Additionally, I just did want to point out something as I like looking at the calendar. We're about to go into October. Um, if you're looking to use podcasts as a way to help you get booked in 2026, now is the time to start. If I said you could have interviews and invitations lined up by the end of this week, but you might not record that for 6 months. I'm sorry, 6 weeks, and that might not come out for 2 months, which means you're already into 2026 with some of that content coming out. So, if you are going to really take this serious, whether it's just doing something like Podmatch or working with someone like me, you should start now if you want it to benefit next year's slate of speaking engagements.
And just to piggyback on what you're saying, Spencer, you can not only take that and get your first draft of your book, but you can slice it up and then have lots of social media content, both
Hmm.
from a visual, audio overlay, or even written content. There's a lot of AI tools that re engineer that, coupled
Hmm.
with taking your content and creating even a coaching platform too. So there's a lot of incredible ways that you can maximize the time you're spending on the podcast, not only just using it as a resume builder of what podcast you're being on. So, yeah, just phenomenal ways where you can leverage podcasts to get you to the next level. And if you want to work with the expert, reach out to Spencer. You can see here he's offering all Conference Connect users 15% off. So make sure that you reach out to Spencer for more information regarding that. Thank you so much again, Spencer. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.